The reed grass was still damp when Charlotte arrived at Westhaven for the first time, and she remembered thinking that the land looked exactly like something that had been misunderstood for a long time. It was the third week of October, and the morning had arrived grey and cool in the way that upstate mornings do when the season has decided, without ceremony, to change. Charlotte Cooper had driven 4 hours from her firm's office, a cardboard tray of coffee balanced on the passenger seat, her survey kit in the trunk, and a 6-week contract folded in the center console. She had read the brief 3 times on the drive up, not because it was complicated, but because she liked to be certain she understood what she was being asked to do before she met the people who had hired her to do it. The contract named Westhaven as a private estate of considerable acreage, asked for a comprehensive wetland health survey, and identified the steward of record as Diane Prewitt. Charlotte was to report all preliminary and final findings to Diane, at Diane's schedule, in Diane's preferred format. The brief used the word coordinate 4 times in 2 paragraphs. Charlotte was 37 years old and had been doing this work for 11 years. She had surveyed coastal buffer zones in 3 states, riparian corridors along 2 river systems, and one very small but very complicated vernal pool on a university campus that had taken her the better part of a semester to untangle. She knew what healthy wetlands sounded like in the morning, the particular chorus of frogs and red-winged blackbirds that meant the hydrology was doing what it was supposed to do. She also knew what sick wetland smelled like, and she had caught a note of it on the breeze before she even got out of the car. She pulled her kit from the trunk and stood at the edge of the gravel lot, looking out at the property. The main house was visible at a distance, a structure of grey stone and dark timber, set back from the access road on a slight rise. Between Charlotte and the house lay an expanse of land that had once clearly been managed with attention, and had not been managed that way for some time. The reed beds were dense in the wrong places. The water table, visible in a standing pool near the access gate, sat higher than the seasonal norm for this part of the state. She wrote one word in the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket: compaction. The main house had a formal entrance, but Charlotte had been directed to the estate office, a converted groundskeeper's cottage set 50 yards to the east of the house, tucked against a stand of Norway spruce that had been planted, by the look of them, sometime in the 1970s. She knocked once and was let in by a woman in a linen blazer who introduced herself without offering her hand. "Diane Prewitt," the woman said. "You must be the surveyor." She said it the way some people say the repairman or the plumber, placing Charlotte neatly into a category of person whose name was secondary to their function. Charlotte introduced herself fully, first and last name, and set her field kit down near the door rather than in the center of the room. Diane gestured toward one of the 2 chairs on the near side of the desk. Charlotte sat. Diane did not. The briefing took 22 minutes. Diane covered the survey parameters, the filing deadlines, the format she expected for interim reports, the dates of the estate's quarterly advisory board review, where Charlotte's preliminary findings would be presented, and the identity of the field contact who would accompany Charlotte in the wetland areas. His name, Diane said, was Marcus. He was one of the maintenance staff. He would open gates, carry equipment, and ensure Charlotte had access to the restricted water management infrastructure. "He knows the property," Diane added, in the tone of someone granting a small concession. "He's been around for a while." Charlotte wrote Marcus's name in her notebook and asked 3 clarifying questions about the water management infrastructure, all of which Diane answered by referring her to a binder she had prepared in advance. The binder was thorough. Charlotte was pleasantly surprised. She thanked Diane, received a key card for the property access gates, and was directed to a guest accommodation in the east wing of the main house, where her gear would fit and where she would find her own entrance so she would not need to trouble the household. She did not ask whether Marcus would be available that afternoon. She went to her room, unpacked her equipment in a methodical order she had learned from years of working in remote locations, and spent the remaining daylight hours walking the property's perimeter with her notebook and her telephoto lens, cataloguing what she could see from the accessible margin before she needed anyone to open gates for her. She met Marcus the following morning. He was already at the gate to the inner wetland enclosure when she arrived at 7:45, standing with his weight on one hip and a thermos in his right hand. He was wearing worn canvas work trousers and a grey fleece that had been washed too many times. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and the kind of hands that looked like they had done significant work at some point, though Charlotte could not have said exactly what kind. He was somewhere in his early to mid-40s, she thought, though the stillness around him made the estimate difficult. "Charlotte Cooper," she said, holding out her hand. "Marcus," he said, shaking it. His grip was direct. He didn't add a last name. He unlocked the gate without ceremony and held it open while she passed through with her equipment. She noted that he opened it correctly, swinging it all the way back against the post, rather than holding it at a 90-degree angle, which was the habitual mistake of people who didn't think about what was being carried through. She did not comment on it. She simply walked through. The inner enclosure was a different world from the managed grounds around the main house. The vegetation was unruly in a way that Charlotte recognized as consequential rather than merely aesthetic. The water table had pushed through in 3 distinct areas she could identify from the surface alone, and the reed grass stood in a monoculture band along the northern margin that suggested a particular kind of phosphorus accumulation she had seen twice before in her career. She told Marcus she was going to walk the perimeter first, taking surface readings at marked intervals, and that she would flag any areas she needed him to open further access to. He nodded, and followed at a distance that she gradually understood was not indifference, but consideration. He was staying out of her way without being asked to. By 10 in the morning, she had flagged 7 points and taken surface readings at all of them. She set up her portable spectrophotometer near the 3rd flag, crouched to calibrate it, and heard Marcus come to a stop about 5 feet behind her. "Dissolved oxygen's going to be low in that sector," he said. She turned. He was looking at the water, not at her. "Yes," she said. "I'd expect between 4 and 5 milligrams per litre. The reed density is blocking the photosynthetic exchange. What's the pump schedule for this section?" He told her in a single sentence with the correct technical terminology. She wrote it down and did not say anything about it yet. They worked through until noon. Marcus carried what she needed him to carry, opened what she needed opened, and answered her questions about the property's water management infrastructure with a precision that continued to be faintly inconsistent with his role as introduced. He knew the pump schedules for all 4 drainage channels by memory. He knew when the inlet valve on the eastern retention basin had last been serviced and by whom. He knew the reasoning behind a realignment of the northern drainage ditch that had been done, he said, about 6 years back. And his explanation of the reasoning was ecologically coherent in a way that suggested the decision had been made by someone who understood conservation outcomes, not just land aesthetics. Charlotte noticed all of it the way she noticed things in the field, quietly, without announcing the noticing, adding each observation to a growing internal file she would sort through later. She had packed a lunch, as she always did in the field. 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a container of fruit, a thermos of coffee. When noon arrived, she settled on a flat stretch of bank near the 2nd flag and opened the kit. Marcus had started to drift back toward the gate, the way hired staff often did when the professional they were assisting sat down to eat, as if the pause in work was also a pause in their legitimacy for being present. "There's an extra sandwich," Charlotte said without looking up. "And coffee if you take it." He came back. He sat down on the bank a few feet from her, not close enough to be presumptuous and not far enough to be performing distance. She poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to him. He took it with both hands. They ate for a few minutes without talking. The blackbirds were active in the reed bed to the north, which Charlotte noted as a positive sign. Where blackbirds foraged willingly, the invertebrate density was usually adequate. "How long has the northern section looked like that?" she asked. He looked at the reed monoculture. 3 seasons, maybe 4. Before that, it was mixed. What changed? He told her about a drainage event 4 years ago, a prolonged wet spring followed by a management decision to block the overflow channel that had historically kept the phosphorus moving. The decision had been made, he said, by the previous management firm. Charlotte wrote it down. Then she explained to him what her methodology involved, not because she was required to, and not because she thought he would use the information, but because she was in the habit of explaining her work to anyone present who seemed to be listening. She walked him through the spectrophotometric analysis, the macroinvertebrate index she would be applying, the transect layout she was planning for weeks 2 and 3, and the hydrological model she would use to project what the wetland would look like, restored, over a 5-year horizon, if the management interventions she expected to recommend were implemented. Marcus asked questions at the right moments, not too many and not simple ones. He asked about the relationship between the macroinvertebrate index and the dissolved oxygen readings she had taken that morning. He asked whether her 5-year model assumed maintained pump activity or passive hydrology. He asked, with a very slight shift in his expression that was not quite a smile, whether she thought the northern section was still recoverable. "Yes," Charlotte said, "if someone's willing to do the work." He looked out at the reed bed. "What would it look like?" he said. "Restored." Charlotte described it with the same directness she used when she described anything she knew well. She talked about the return of the mixed reed and sedge community, the water clarity that would come back once the phosphorus load dropped, the frogs and the diving beetles and the particular species of dragonfly that would colonize a restored wetland of this type within 2 or 3 seasons of successful management. She talked about the sound of it, which she said was different from the sound of damaged wetland in a way that was specific enough to be recognizable once you had heard it. She did not realize until she had been talking for nearly 3 minutes that she was not speaking to him the way she might explain things to an advisory board. She was speaking to him the way she spoke to Becca, her field assistant who was driving up from the firm's office that afternoon. She was speaking to him as if his understanding of what she was saying mattered to her. It did. That was the thing she didn't examine yet. Marcus held her gaze after she finished. He didn't say anything for a moment. The blackbirds called twice in the reed bed. Then he looked back at the water, and the moment passed in the way that moments do when neither person involved is ready to name them. Becca Lund arrived at 4 in the afternoon in a rental that was too small for her equipment and her opinions. She was 29, sharp-eyed, and had the habit of assessing situations before she had been introduced to anyone in them. Charlotte met her in the gravel lot and helped carry the overflow gear to the guest accommodation. And by the time they had dinner in the estate's staff dining room, Becca had already formed a comprehensive view of Diane Prewitt, based on a 3-minute exchange in the hallway. "She counted my equipment cases," Becca said. "Why would she count them?" "Leave it," Charlotte said. "I'm just saying, she counted them." Charlotte ate her soup and changed the subject to the macroinvertebrate transect she wanted to run in week 2. Becca let it go, because she always let things go when Charlotte changed the subject with sufficient calm. But she did not forget. Becca rarely forgot anything she had filed. The weeks in the field accumulated in the way that field weeks do. Long days with visible progress. Cold mornings that warmed by noon, the slow piecing together of a picture that had been obscured by years of inattention. Charlotte and Marcus fell into a rhythm that was comfortable without being casual. He was always at the gate before her. He always knew the access codes she would need for the day's section. He carried the water quality meters without being asked, and set them down at the gradient intervals she had specified without being reminded. He also kept asking questions that she kept unswitting fully, and the warmth that had begun on the bank at noon on the second day deepened through those exchanges in a way that Charlotte was aware of without yet examining. She noticed that his questions had become more specific over time, more calibrated to the particular challenges of this wetland, rather than to ecological surveying in general. She noticed that he sometimes arrived at a conclusion she was working toward just before she stated it, the way a person arrives at the end of a sentence they have heard before. She noticed that when she was working, he watched the work with what she could only describe as proprietary attention, though she did not use that word internally, not yet. She also noticed, and this she filed under a different category, that he never initiated a conversation about himself. He answered direct questions with a sentence or two, and then redirected. He had no opinion about the estate management firm, at least none he offered. He had no story about how he had come to be at Westhaven, no family detail volunteered, no complaint about his wages or his accommodations. He was simply present and attentive, and occasionally precise in a way that didn't quite fit. The review dinner was held on a Thursday evening in the 4th week of the survey. Diane had organised it in the estate's formal dining room, a long room with dark panelling and a table that seated 12. 7 members of the advisory board attended, including 2 who had driven from some distance, and Owen Prewitt arrived from wherever he had been and took the seat at Diane's left. Charlotte had been asked to present her preliminary findings at the end of the first course. She had prepared a 2-page summary and a set of spectrophotometric charts that she had printed at the estate office that afternoon. She kept the presentation tight, 8 minutes, and walked the board through her dissolved oxygen readings, her macroinvertebrate index preliminary results, and her initial assessment of the phosphorus loading in the northern section. Diane let her finish. Then Diane turned to the board and said, in a tone she might have used to correct a student's arithmetic, that the findings were preliminary and should be understood as such, that the northern section's condition had been assessed by a firm the previous year and had been found to be within acceptable parameters, and that until the final report was filed, the board should hold its conclusions. One of the board members, a man named Gareth, who wore a jacket that had been expensive once, nodded as if this clarified something. Another member asked Charlotte whether her methodology accounted for seasonal variation. Charlotte said yes, and described exactly how. Diane moved to the next item on the agenda before Charlotte had finished her sentence. Owen refilled his wineglass and said, to no one in particular, that he had always found wetlands to be a bit of a specialized interest. Charlotte collected her charts, thanked the board, and returned to her chair. She ate the rest of dinner with her hands level on the table and her expression unchanged. 2 evenings later, she was walking back from the northern margin at dusk, later than she intended, her boots wet and her notebook full. The estate office lights were on. The window faced the path she was using, and as she came level with it, she heard Diane's voice clearly through the glass, which was old and single-paned and did not seal properly at the bottom. The contract renewal isn't happening regardless, Diane said. I've already told the firm we won't be extending. She can file whatever she likes. Owen's voice lower. You think the report will cause problems? No, Diane said, because no one who matters will act on it. The board defers to me on land management decisions. That's how it works. Charlotte stood on the path for 3 seconds. Then she walked on. She had known, abstractly, that the contract might not renew. She had not known it had already been decided. She had not known that the filing of the report, which she had understood to be the point of the exercise, was, in Diane's estimation, already beside the point. She went to her room. She sat on the bed in her wet field clothes and held the notebook in her lap for a long time. Then she put it on the bedside table and took a shower and made herself a cup of tea with the electric kettle on the desk, and she sat with it until it was cold. Becca knocked at 8:30. Charlotte let her in. Becca sat on the desk chair and looked at Charlotte's face and did not immediately say anything, which was how Charlotte knew Becca was taking the situation seriously. "The board doesn't matter," Charlotte said eventually. "The report does." Becca waited. "I'm going to file it in full," Charlotte said. "Everything I have, all 6 weeks of it." To Diane. "To Marcus, he's the designated field contact. Diane specified that in the brief. All field documentation goes through the field contact." Becca looked at her for a moment. "That's technically correct." "It's entirely correct," Charlotte said. "It's in the contract." She spent the final 2 weeks completing the survey with the same method she had applied to the first 4. She did not allow the overheard conversation to change the pace of her work or the specificity of her notes. She added 2 additional transect readings in week 5 when her macroinvertebrate data suggested an anomaly in the southern section, because the anomaly mattered regardless of who would ultimately read the analysis. The southern section confirmed an additional phosphorus input source that the previous management firm had not identified. She added it to the report. Marcus was quieter in the final 2 weeks, she thought, though perhaps no quieter than usual, and she was simply more attuned. He was present at every session. He carried the meters. He opened the gates. He answered her questions, which were now fewer because she had most of what she needed. On a Wednesday afternoon in week 5, they were standing at the edge of the restored section she had been tracking, a small area where a temporary flow adjustment they had made in week 3 had already produced a visible improvement in the reed and sedge density, and he stood beside her, and they both looked at it without speaking. "It's working," she said. "Yes," he said. That was the whole conversation. The report took her 4 evenings to finish. It ran to 31 pages plus appendices, a complete record of 6 weeks of measurements, analysis, and projections. She had included a restoration proposal with 3 implementation scenarios mapped to varying budget levels, because she thought whoever eventually used the report should have options. The 5-year hydrology model was in the appendix. The macroinvertebrate index, referenced against the regional baseline, was in the appendix. Everything was in the appendix. She printed 2 copies at the estate office on a Friday morning, spiral-bound them herself, and drove out to the northern enclosure where Marcus was doing a routine gate inspection. He saw her coming and waited. She handed him the report. "Final survey," she said. "Full findings, appendices included." He took it with both hands the way he had taken the coffee on the first day. He looked at the cover page, which read, "West Haven Estate Wetland Health Survey, Final Report, submitted by Charlotte Cooper, Ecological Surveyor." He turned to the first page and read the opening paragraph. He turned to the restoration proposal. "You included 3 scenarios," he said. "Budget is a real variable," Charlotte said. "Whoever acts on this should have room to work with what's available." He looked at the page for another moment. "I'm glad you filed it," he said. His hand was near hers on the survey kit she was still carrying. Not touching. Near. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the temperature drop at the water's edge. Specifically, and without drama. "Someone should know what this land needs," she said. She turned and walked back toward the house. Becca spent her last evening at the estate organizing map data for a different project she had brought along, pulling county deed information to cross-reference against a hydrological map layer she was building for a separate survey in the same region. She was using a public GIS portal, which she did routinely, and she was running an ownership lookup for the parcel numbers, that adjacent to the West Haven boundary, because the hydrological basin didn't respect property lines, and she needed to know who she would be dealing with if the adjacent parcel drainage turned out to matter. The GIS portal returned West Haven's deed information along with the adjacent parcels because the county had digitized its records 3 years ago, and the lookup was comprehensive. Becca looked at it. She looked at it again. West Haven was held by a land management entity, which was not unusual for a private estate of this size. The land management entity was itself a registered subsidiary of a holding company. The holding company's beneficial owner was registered in the county's deed records as the controlling party of record, because the county required it for tax assessment purposes, and it was a matter of public record that anyone with internet access and enough patience could find. The name was Marcus Hale. Becca sat very still. Then she took a photograph of the screen with her phone, because she was a methodical person and she understood that the photograph would matter. She went next door and knocked on Charlotte's door. Charlotte was already in bed reading. She looked at Becca's face and sat up. Becca showed her the phone. Charlotte looked at the name for a long time. Then she handed the phone back. "How certain are you?" she said. "It's the county deed record," Becca said. "Public, unambiguous." Charlotte lay back against the headboard. She looked at the ceiling. "2 layers," Becca said. "The management entity and the holding company. He owns the estate through both of them." Charlotte thought about the questions he had asked from the first morning. The pump schedules he had memorized. The drainage realignment 6 years ago that he had explained with the reasoning of someone who had made the decision. She thought about the way he looked at the report's cover page when she handed it to him. She thought about him saying he was glad she filed it. "He already knew everything I was measuring," she said. "Probably most of it," Becca said. "He let me explain it anyway." The formal estate meeting had been scheduled for the following morning, a Friday. Diane had organized it as a quarterly review with the full advisory board, and what she described in the meeting notice as legal and administrative representation. Charlotte had assumed she would attend only briefly, to be thanked for the completed survey and informed of the firm's decision regarding renewal. She had been prepared for exactly that. She arrived with Becca at 9 in the morning. The formal meeting room was on the ground floor of the main house, a room with high windows and a long conference table. 7 board members were already seated, along with Owen at Diane's right. A man in a dark suit, whom Charlotte did not recognize, sat at the end of the table near a leather portfolio. Marcus was already in the room. He was sitting at the far end of the table, not at the side where the maintenance staff and field contractors typically sat, but at the table itself, in the chair that Charlotte had assumed was reserved for the estate's formal representative. He was wearing a clean white shirt. He had the same stillness he always had. He was reading something in a folder when Charlotte entered, and he did not look up immediately. Diane was standing near the head of the table. She looked at Charlotte with the expression of someone who has organized an event and is quietly satisfied with its composition. She gestured toward the chairs along the near wall. The man in the dark suit opened his portfolio. He had a clipped, precise way of speaking that Charlotte associated with attorneys. He said he was representing the estate's legal administrative interests and that he had a brief matter to address before the meeting's agenda proceeded. He looked at Marcus. "Mr. Hale," he said, "the property transfer notification you requested has been prepared. The controlling interest in the West Haven estate, currently registered through Meridian Land Holdings and its parent entity, Hale Conservation Trust, remains in your name as of this filing. Your signature is required on page 4. He slid the document down the table. Marcus picked up a pen from the table in front of him and signed without looking at Diane. The room absorbed this. The attorney took the document back, made a notation in his portfolio, and sat down. Diane's hand, which had been resting on the back of the chair beside her, pressed down. Charlotte watched her recalibrate. It was a process that took approximately 4 seconds and was not subtle. "Marcus," Diane said. She used his first name with a weight that suggested she was attempting to place him in a familiar category. The hired hand she had briefed Charlotte about on the first day, the maintenance contact who opened gates. "I wasn't aware that you'd be present in this capacity." "I own the property, Diane," Marcus said. "I'm generally present at the quarterly meetings." His voice was level. It was the same voice he had used to describe the pump schedules at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning with dew on the gate. "The survey report," Marcus said, looking toward the attorney, "has been received and reviewed. I've asked council to enter it into the estate's formal land management record as the primary ecological assessment for the next planning cycle." He looked at Charlotte, directly and without preparation. "It's thorough," he said. "The restoration scenarios in particular." Diane said something. Charlotte did not retain the exact words because she was looking at the report on the table. Her report, the spiral-bound copy she had handed Marcus at the gate on a Friday morning with her name on the cover. It was sitting at his elbow. He had brought it to the meeting. "The contract with Ms. Cooper's firm," Marcus said to the attorney, "should be reviewed for extension. The southern section finding alone warrants a follow-up survey in the spring." He paused. "At full rate." The attorney made a note. Owen cleared his throat. Diane said something about the advisory board's role in contract approvals. Marcus looked at her with a patience that was, Charlotte thought, a very specific form of restraint. "The advisory board advises," Marcus said. "Contract authority rests with the estate's principal. That's in the management agreement." He turned back to the attorney. "We can move to the agenda." Becca, sitting beside Charlotte, found her notebook in her bag and wrote something on the corner of a page and slid it towards Charlotte's knee, without looking at her. Charlotte glanced at it. Becca had written, 2 layers. Charlotte almost smiled. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. Diane spoke less as it proceeded. When she did speak, she addressed herself to the agenda items, rather than to the room. The advisory board members recalibrated in the way that advisory boards do, attentive to whoever holds the actual weight in the room. Owen said very little after the first 10 minutes, and what he said was procedural. When it was done and people were gathering their things, Gareth, the board member with the jacket that had been expensive once, stopped beside Charlotte and said he had found the macroinvertebrate index quite illuminating. Charlotte thanked him and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say. Diane passed Charlotte near the door. She didn't stop. She said, with the controlled courtesy of someone who has decided that courtesy is the safest option available, "Your report was very complete." Charlotte said, "Thank you. The land warranted it." Diane walked out. Marcus found Charlotte at the edge of the formal garden after the meeting, a path that ran along the south side of the house before it opened onto the field that led down to the wetland. He was carrying his folder. She was carrying her field kit, which she had not set down at any point during the meeting. "You knew," she said. She wasn't asking. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry for the structure of it. It was necessary." She thought about that. "The management firm before Diane's arrangement," she said. "The drainage decision that caused the phosphorus loading in the northern section. That was 6 years ago." "Yes." "Was that you, trying to fix it?" He looked at the field. "I've been trying to fix it for 3 years. I needed to know if someone could tell me what was actually happening before I made more decisions." "You needed a surveyor." "I needed a good one," he said. "And I needed to know she wasn't going to file a comfortable report, because she thought that's what the steward wanted." Charlotte thought about the overheard conversation in the cottage office. She thought about sitting on the bed in her wet field clothes with the cold tea. She thought about printing the report and carrying it across the gravel lot and handing it to him at the gate. I would have filed it regardless, she said. I know, he said. I knew from the second day. He walked with her to the northern enclosure. She had a few remaining measurements to collect, a final data point for the appendix she wanted to complete before she left the property. He held the gate as she walked through. He followed at the distance he had always followed, not too close and not performing distance. The northern section looked the way it had always looked from this angle, the monoculture reed bed dense and dull against the sky. But the small area in the south of the enclosure, the section they had watched together on the Wednesday afternoon in week 5, was visibly different. The sedge was filling in. The surface water was cleaner. 2 coots were working the margin, which was a species that had not been present when Charlotte arrived. She took her measurements and wrote them in the notebook. They were what she had expected. She closed the notebook. The light was doing the thing it does at the end of October, turning the field grass gold and making the water look deeper than it was. She stood at the edge of the bank where she had sat on the second day with her lunch and her thermos and the extra sandwich she had offered without thinking about it, because offering was a habit she had not learned to stop. Marcus was standing a few feet behind her, looking at the same water. "What does it need?" he said. "To get to where you described it." 3 years of the management plan in Scenario 2, Charlotte said. Possibly 2 if the spring hydrology cooperates. Someone will need to monitor the inlet valve on the eastern basin through the first winter. The coots are a good sign. He came to stand beside her. Not at a distance, beside her. Close enough that she could see the edge of the spiral-bound report he had tucked under his arm, its pages marked with small yellow tabs that had not been there when she printed it. He had read it. She looked at the tabs. "You read the whole thing," she said. "Several times," he said. "The dissolved oxygen projections in Section 4 needed a second pass." She turned to look at him. He was watching the coots. "I'll be coming back in the spring," she said, "for the follow-up survey." "I know," he said. The coots moved further out into the channel, one following the other, unhurried. The reed grass moved in a small wind that had come up from the east. Charlotte looked at the water and thought about what it would sound like in 3 years. The sound of a restored wetland. The particular morning chorus she had described to him on the second day, while he listened in a way that she now understood differently than she had understood it then. She had told him the truth about the land, because it was the truth, and it mattered. She had filed the report because the work was the work, regardless of who read it. She had explained her methodology to a man she thought was a maintenance hand, because his understanding had seemed worth having. All of that was the same as it had been. What had changed was simply the frame around it, the frame that made visible what had always been true. That someone had been watching the work from the first morning, and that the watching had mattered in every way she had not known to count. The last light left the water in a slow gold fade. Charlotte stood at the edge of her findings, at the edge of the land she had spent 6 weeks learning, and she did not move to go. The reed grass settled. The coots disappeared into the channel's shadow. Somewhere in the northern section, a frog called once, a sound she had not heard from that corner of the wetland in all 6 weeks of the survey. It was a wood frog, she thought. An early returner to a place that was slowly becoming habitable again. She wrote it down.